So, today, rather than any fancy storytelling or amazing cinematography, we're just going to spend some time telling you what the i4 actually is. It is an EV. It's a Grand Coupe. It is the first M Sport EV. It's sporty, but it's efficient. It is exhilarating, but comfortable. All of those words have been used by BMW to describe this one car, just the i4. Okay, so let's start with the basics. It's a 4, not a 3, which means that it's got the, or upright kidney grills if you're from BMW, and it's got the more swooping rear, which means there's a little bit less headroom, so if you're sort of my height, it's a little bit more cramped. There are 3 versions of the i4 at the moment. There's the i4 eDrive 40, there's the i4 eDrive 40 M Sport, and there's the i4 M50, all of which you will agree are terrible names for cars, but it's actually quite a simple system. But looking at it, you wouldn't really know it's an M car, apart from the fact that it's got a couple of M badges, is not a lot. It's got the big cheeks on the front, which would normally be scooping more air into the brake ducts and the engine, but it doesn't have an engine, so that's not really necessary. At the back, it's got a diffuser, which is incredibly fake, and for some reason, it's got exhaust surrounds, despite the fact that it doesn't have them. But other than that, well, it's incredibly inoffensive. What this car appears to be trying to do is not be an EV. It doesn't want to look different, which is interesting considering all of the other EV manufacturers at the moment are really trying to be exactly that, different. In here, it's doing exactly the same thing as on the outside, trying not to look any different to a normal car. So everything apart from that humongous amount of screen in front of me just looks like I'm in a 3 Series. A 3 Series with some carbon fibre because it's got an M badge, but other than that, it's very BMW. And it's got the latest version of iDrive, iDrive 8, would you believe? And that system is still very good, full of features, but perhaps takes a second or two to get used to. It's not as intuitive to use as maybe the ones in a Tesla or a Polestar with its Google integration. But you can go, hey BMW, change the internal temperature to 20.5 degrees.
I will set the temperature to 20.5 degrees Celsius everywhere.
And eventually it'll do it. The big screen looks really good and it's very nice to use, but I would say it's deliberately meant to look proud from the rest of it. You can sometimes touch it and feel it gets really rather hot, especially on a sunny day as we've had today, and from some angles it sort of looks like it's propped there rather than actually sitting there. Power for the i4 M50 comes from all 4 wheels. There's a motor on each axle, but it will spend most of its time sending all of that power straight back to its bum. That's how all BMWs should be, and it would be nice to think that BMW is doing that because they understand that that's what we want from them and tradition, but it's not, I'm afraid. It's just because it's more efficient. Boring, I know, but it's true. Power to the back, steering at the front, much better. It can, though, send almost all that power forwards if it needs to. For example, if you were doing some of those 0 to 62 mile an hour in 3.9 second starts, then it would pop some power to the front to give you more traction, and you can feel it when it happens. It's also got air suspension on the back, fancy, nice adjustable traction control, and a very good system to balance the change between regen and physical braking, so that you don't get one of those jolts that you sometimes can find on EVs when one stops and the other begins. It's also got a boost function, which gives you the extra power all the way up to 544 horsepower and 795 Newton meters of torque. That's the only way you can do those 0 to 60 times of 3.9 seconds. It sounds like Porsche's Sport Response system, but this system can just be used over and over again as long as the batteries will allow. And that rather noisy sound coming from Hans Zimmer himself. The i4 M50 has an 83.9 kilowatt-hour battery, which means a total maximum range of around 318 miles, and it will charge from 10 to 80% in just 31 minutes if you find a 200 kilowatt charger. Driving wise, we first need to address the elephant in the room, and that elephant is this car. because it weighs 2,295 kilograms. 2,295, which for a car with an M badge is 500 kilograms more than an M4. And you can feel it, if I'm honest. You can, through the corners, feel how heavy this car is. No matter how good the damping is, the suspension, and you can feel the suspension rides slightly softer in order to be compliant with that amount of weight, which means that when you hit a big bump, there is a following secondary wave of slight movement just as it tries to gather itself together. The damping is excellent, but it really is trying to deal with a lot of weight.
Another quick note on the sheer mass. As you floor the i4, you can feel that after that massive wave of instant torque hurls it away down the line, that mid-range acceleration does begin to slow down. On turn-in, the i4 feels well composed, but the weight shift is noticeable. The car doesn't roll a massive amount, rather commendably, but as you exit the corner there's just a second where the softer springs need to gather everything back together again.
That said, that's very nearly the only fault, because for all its weight, it drives incredibly well. It is sat down without ever feeling particularly leery, which maybe is where you could criticise it, but we'll come to that in a sec. The steering, in its comfort or Eco Pro modes, is quite light, but once you put it in the proper sport mode, it weights up as you would hope for. There is a slightly strange, almost dead zone in the middle where it's still very, very light, and you just feel it kick in as you get past the vertical. But that's the only real problem. It gives you a decent amount of feedback, and you can feel some proper torque steer coming when the front axle kicks into life. And if you really hustle it through a corner and it sends power to the front to try and keep everything all reined together, you will feel a little bit of understeer. You'll feel the front axle just begin to scrabble as it tries to pull everything together. But considering it's also trying to haul all of those batteries that are based right underneath me in the floor around, it does a very good job. The acceleration from very slow speeds is, even if you've driven a whole load of electric cars, still very shocking, and even in Eco Pro mode will smash your head back into the head restraint. And the adjustable damping is very good, and the change up to sport mode isn't that violent, probably because it still needs to rein in all of that weight. It never becomes really very firm, it just stays more compliant. When you're in comfort mode, it's an easy, comfortable cruiser. One of the great things is that that braking system really does work very well. There is none of that jarring sensation you can feel in many, many EVs as it goes from regen into braking. It's just a smooth transition, and that gives you far more confidence on the brake pedal as you go into a corner.
You're not going to solve any real understeer issues here with a big old boot of throttle that brings the rear axle back into line. But you do still drive using power adjustment. In this case, you just use the torque vectoring to your advantage. Boot it and you can get the car to turn in happily. The i4, though, is a bit more about walking a tightrope between extra front traction and a little bit of rear slip than gloriously trying to shred that posterior rubber. You're more using the power to pull the front end around than getting the back end to step out. But back to that original question. What is the i4?
Well, it's not confused. That's the truth. It may sound confused, but that's just because of the M badge. And the M badge actually is doing this car a real disservice, because underneath, what it is an incredibly good, quite luxurious, nice to be in family saloon car. And it doesn't need to be anything else. Perhaps it should have been called the 340 rather than the M50, because it replaces that old section in the BMW lineup, the quite fast, spacious family car. And then, perhaps what it also is an EV without gimmicks. Every other EV on the market at the moment needs to have a thing. Hyundai and Kia are making excellent EVs, but they're all something different. Mercedes looks like a fish, as does Genesis. Tesla is full of whoopee cushions and things. This is just a car as people know it that just happens to be an electric one. And that is perhaps exactly what the world needs right now. And more importantly, exactly what BMW needs right now.